In this Genshin Impact guide, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about elements and elemental reactions, as well as how you can use them to dramatically increase your damage output, going from this all the way over to this. We're gonna keep it beginner friendly and explain everything step by step. So if that sounds good to you, then let's jump right into it. Now, first of all, there's one important thing to know that not a lot of people talk about, but that is crucial to understanding elements in Genshin Impact. See, in other RPGs, every enemy usually has a specific elemental weakness, and if you use that very element against them, you get a damage bonus. However, in Genshin, enemies don't really have elemental strength or weaknesses. Here, your damage bonus comes not from using the one right element against the enemy, but rather from triggering elemental reactions. Now, what is an elemental reaction? Well, every time you hit an enemy with a certain element, you can see its elemental symbol over their head. This element is now applied to them. If then a second element is applied to them, an elemental reaction is triggered. That always happens the moment two different elements are combined on an enemy. Now, as you surely know, Genshin Impact currently has 7 different elements: Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, Electro, Anemo, Geo, and Dendro. And that means there are a lot of possible combinations. So in the rest of the video, we're now going to break down every possible elemental reaction, what they exactly do, if they're good or not, and most importantly, how you can squeeze the most damage out of them. So without further ado, let's begin. Freeze is the first element on our list, and it happens when Hydro meets Cryo. What it does is pretty straightforward. It freezes the enemy so they turn into a block of ice and can't move. That's of course cool, because enemies that can't move can hurt you. However, bigger enemies like bosses or elite foes usually don't get physically frozen like the smaller enemies. However, they will still get the quote-unquote frozen status applied to them. Now, why is that important? Because of the next reaction on our list, and that would be Shatter. Shatter occurs when a frozen enemy is hit with a blunt attack, giving you a 1.5 times damage multiplier for that attack. Now, what is a blunt attack? Well, there's an entire list of attacks in the wiki which are considered blunt attacks, but to put it simply, blunt attacks are heavy-hitting attacks like plunging attacks, attacks with the Geo element, and all hits that you deal with a Claymore character. If this now sounds a bit complicated, then don't worry, because Shatter is actually not an important reaction to know, and most teams don't really focus on it. So while you're down there, give the video a like so the YouTube gods don't hate me. Cheers for that, by the way. Let's look at some stronger reactions that you might actually want to go for. Vaporize happens when Hydro and Pyro are combined on an enemy. And important to know is, for Vaporize, the order in which you apply the two elements actually matters. If you first apply Pyro and then trigger the reaction with Hydro, you get a big 2 times damage multiplier. On the other side, if you first apply Hydro and then trigger the reaction with Pyro, you only get a 1.5 times damage multiplier. So naturally, you would say you want to go for the 2 times, right? Well, not exactly. I don't want to get too much into detail here, but when you go for the 2 times combination, it takes longer before you can trigger the same reaction again than it would if you only go for the 1.5 times. So what you really want to do in practice is try to get the 1.5 times version as often as possible and trigger that multiple times, which will then lead to more damage over time. The next reaction is Melt, which is the combination of Pyro and Cryo, and it works pretty much exactly the same like Vaporize. If you first apply Cryo and then Pyro, you get the 2 times multiplier, but it takes longer before you can apply it again. And if you first do Pyro and then Cryo, you get the 1.5 times, which can be triggered more often. But now, let's come to a very strong reaction: Overload. Overload occurs when Pyro meets Electro, the order in which doesn't matter this time, and the effect is that it causes a big explosion, dealing Pyro damage with a fat 2 times damage multiplier, and also it blows smaller enemies back. On the one hand, that's of course good for ranged characters who don't want to be caught up in melee combat, but on the other hand, it's a problem for melee characters because usually you want to be in melee combat with the enemy, and if you always throw them back with every overload reaction, then this is going to be very tedious. However, against big bosses, which don't get bounced around by the explosion, overload is a very strong choice. Next, we have Electro charged as the combination of Hydro and Electro. Also here, the order doesn't matter. What Electro charge does is, it tases the enemy every second as long as both Hydro and Electro are present on the enemy. Each of these, let's call them zaps, then deals electro damage and gets a 1.2 times damage multiplier. So you deal multiple smaller hits rather than one big one. However, the special thing about Electro Charged, and that makes it really powerful, is while it is active, both elements, Hydro and Electro, are still on the enemy. So if you hit an electrocharged enemy with a third element, that element will then trigger its reaction with Hydro or Electro at the same time. For example, if we have an electrocharged enemy and then hit him with Pyro, that enemy will then be electrocharged and overloaded all at the same time. Good luck trying to survive that. Up next is Superconduct. Superconduct is the combination of Electro and Cryo, and what it does is it deals a little bit of AoE cryo damage, but what you really want to use it for is for its effect that it reduces the enemy's physical resistance by 40%. In other words, if you hit an enemy with your normal physical attacks after Superconduct has been applied, those physical attacks will then deal way more damage. By the way, that's also why physical damage dealers usually happen to be Cryo or Electro characters. But let's now look at a very special reaction, Swirl. Swirl happens when Anemo is combined with either Cryo, Electro, Pyro, or Hydro. What Swirl does is, it deals AoE damage of the elements that it came into contact with and also spreads them to nearby enemies, effectively triggering a wild chain reaction of all types of different, well, reactions. This makes Swirl a very solid reaction to deal big damage against larger groups of multiple enemies. Unlike our next one, Crystallize. Crystallize is the combination of Geo with either Cryo, Electro, Pyro, or Hydro. And it doesn't deal any damage at all. Instead, it generates a crystal that gives you a shield of the respective element once you pick it up. Crystallize is a very unpopular reaction. First, because it doesn't deal any damage by itself, and second, because the shields from actual shield characters are always better and will provide more protection than the ones you pick up through Crystallize. So, long story short, in most situations, it's best to completely avoid Crystallize in the first place. One thing you shouldn't avoid though is leaving the channel a sub so you'll never miss out on helpful Genshin guides day one. Welcome to the crew. Now, so far, we talked about every element but one, Dendro. Dendro is arguably the strongest element in the game at the moment because of its extremely powerful reactions. So, let's take a look at them right now. If Dendro is combined with Pyro, then the enemy starts burning, dealing constant Pyro damage over time. This is nice overall, but other Dendro reactions are better, so we rather go for them. The next one on the list is Bloom. Bloom happens when Dendro is combined with Hydro, and what it does is it creates an object called Dendro Core on the field. Now, Dendro Cores will do nothing just yet, just be there and explode after a few seconds, dealing a bit of Dendro damage in a small AoE, but that is actually really negligible. The real strength from these Dendro Cores lies in their reactions when they come into contact with either Pyro or Electro. Here's what I mean. When a Dendro Core is hit by Pyro, the Burgeon reaction occurs. Burgeon also explodes the Dendro Core in a small AoE, but in comparison to its natural explosion, with Burgeon, this Dendro AoE damage gets a fat 3 times damage multiplier. Similarly, when a Dendro Core comes into contact with Electro, the Hyper Bloom reaction occurs, turning that Dendro Core into a projectile that flies towards the nearest enemy, dealing also Dendro damage, also with a fat 3x multiplier. One thing to note here though, the explosions from both Burgeon and Hyperbloom, as well as the ones from the normal Dendro cores once they're timed out, can all damage your own character as well if you're too close to them. Now, the damage here is not really that high, but if you want to be safe, then rather use a shield character in your party when playing with those reactions, just so you're protected. And last, but definitely not least, we have two very special reactions between Dendro and Electro. Not Dendro cores and Electro, Dendro normal and Electro. First, if Dendro and Electro meet, the enemy gets affected by the Quicken status. In and of itself, this does nothing just yet. However, if you hit a quickened enemy with Dendro again, this will cause the spread reaction, dealing Dendro damage with a 1.25 times damage multiplier. And if a quickened enemy is hit with Electro again, this will then cause the aggravate reaction, dealing Electro damage with a 1.15 times damage multiplier. Now, we've talked a lot about the different damage multipliers that all the reactions provide. However, this was actually only half the truth, because if you really want to deal a ton of damage, then what matters is not only the reaction's damage multiplier, but also your character stats like attack, crit, elemental mastery, and so on. But depending on which reactions you actually trigger, you want to focus on different character stats. And which ones these are is exactly what we're going to look at right now. Now, first of all, and the most important thing to keep in mind here is, the only thing that matters is the stats of the character triggering the reactions. The character who applies the first element is ignored completely. So at first, it's best if you test out which one of your characters is usually triggering your reactions, and then you upgrade this one. But with all the different attributes, attack, crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, and so on, which one should you focus on? Well, that's what we'll look at right now. Most reactions in the game, they're called transformative reactions, only take into account your character's level and your elemental mastery when calculating the reaction's damage. So when you have a character who constantly triggers one of these reactions in the background right here, make sure to always keep them at their maximum possible level and give them high elemental mastery. In contrast to that, Melt and Vaporize take basically all your stats into account, so it's best to have a well-rounded mix of attack, elemental mastery, and crit on your characters if you go for these reactions. And finally, Spread and Aggravate are pretty much the same, just that they also consider your character's level. Now, if this all was a lot of new input for you, then you're probably still a pretty new player. And that's perfectly fine. But if you want to avoid making typical beginner mistakes and start your journey out as strong as possible, then you absolutely must check out my top 10 beginner tips right here. I hope to see you all in the next one, and until then, as always, travel smart.